We're back with another episode of Photoshop CC, the complete guide. And we're in week 3. In week 3, you can see our subjects here. We're about to dive into, with 7 sessions to go, we're heading into Smart Objects. Smart Objects is one of my favorite features in Photoshop. There are certain other areas I'll say that about, like blending modes and a few other things, but really it is something that fundamentally changed the way I thought about Photoshop. And the difference in mindset before Adobe added Smart Objects and after was dramatic. And so we're going to take a look at what are they, what do they help us with, and when do they get in our way as well. But we're going to jump into Photoshop so we can spend as much time as possible there, and we're going to look at Smart Objects. Here I have 2 identical images. I just opened the same image twice. You'll see at the top of each image here, this one says Smart. This one over here says No Smart, meaning it's not smart. So I'm going to work on the image that's on the left, and I'm going to turn that image into a Smart Object. Now, let me get my layers visible here so you can see what's going on. When you have a layer that's not a Smart Object, the thumbnail image for that layer just looks like a miniature version of the picture. But if I go to the Layer menu and I choose Smart Objects and I choose Convert to Smart Object, watch that little thumbnail image within my Layers panel. The image itself on the main screen will look no different, but in the Layers panel, I'm going to see now this symbol. That's your only indication that this layer is now special. It is a Smart Object. Now, when you turn something into a Smart Object, I think of it as taking a picture and sliding it into a protective container. Just think of it as a Ziploc bag. You just slid your picture in and you sealed it shut. So now, anything you do to that particular layer cannot directly affect what's inside that Ziploc bag. Instead, it's only going to be settings that are attached to that layer in a temporary fashion, where they don't permanently change what's inside the Smart Object. It's like we put it in some sort of protective bubble, if you could say. So let's work with these 2 images and see how it's going to be different, working with a Smart Object and working with a normal layer. First, let's work with the image on the right that is not a Smart Object. I'm going to scale that image. I'll use the image size dialog to accomplish this, or actually I could use image size, or I can select all. I'll do the select all part, and I'll choose free transform, because that's the thing we've used more often during this event than image size. So let's just do free transform. I'm going to scale this down. My background color happens to be green at the moment, which is why you see green there. But I'm going to make it tiny. Do you see how tiny it is? And then I'm going to press Return or Enter to say I'm done. You know what the problem is right now? Is it did that permanently. If I save and close this picture, the only record it has of what the image looks like is what we have right now. And if I zoom up on what we have right now, that's all it is. That's all the information we have for where we used to have that full picture. It does not remember the rest of the image if I save and close the picture. Right now, I could always choose Undo, and it would bring it back. But if I save and close, then that undo is cleared out, and I can't get to it. So now let's take that image and scale it back up to make it bigger again. So I'll type Command-T, and I'll scale this up. Press Return or Enter to say I'm done. And that's what we get. That's all you get, because when we scaled it down, it discarded a bunch of information. So we only ended up with the image taking up a few pixels in width and a few pixels in height. When you scale that up, you just get a blurry version of those few pixels. And I can't even tell what's in the picture, right? Well, let's work with the image on the left instead. And I'll save you by, I'll reset my background color so it's not green this time. And I'm going to type Command-T to transform, just like we did with the other one. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to bring it down, make it just about as small. I'll try to even go smaller if I can. Press Return or Enter to say I'm done. Now that did not at all affect the original contents that was turned into a smart object. That smart object still contains a pristine version of whatever the layer looked like at the moment I turned it into a smart object. And it will always maintain that pristine version, regardless of what I do to this layer. And so if I zoom up to it, it's not going to look different than the other one. You see how few pixels it looks like it's made out of? But if I decide to scale it up again later, I type Command T, grab that corner, pull it back up. And you can see that it still has all the information in it, so that when I transform it to make it smaller and larger again, all it's doing is adding a setting to that layer that says we have the full contents of the original smart object, and we just attach to it a percentage that says scale down to 2% of its original size. When we scaled it back up, it just changed that number from 2% to something else. And in fact, we can see it. If I type Command T, there'll be a number up here. 103, I scaled it up a little larger than the original when I brought it back up. But right here, if I just type in 100 and 100, it'll be exactly the original size. And that's all it did, is it attached those two numbers to the layer. So it was thinking that when you display this image, take all that original content, scale it down to that size when you display it, but it still contains the full original. It's kind of weird. But this would have been a much more useful thing to do back when I was creating the image we made with layers. If you remember, we had a bunch of black and white photographs of dirty icebergs. They had volcanic dust on them and stuff. We put them in a document, and I took one of them and made it show up inside some text and all that. Well, when I did that, I ended up scaling those images down, each one individually, and when I was done, it didn't take up the full width of the document. So I decided to scale it back up to fit. Well, anytime you scale up and you're not using a smart object, it's getting softer and softer as you do. If you're using a smart object, it's always calculating that scaling based on the original size of the picture, whatever size it was at the moment you turned it into a smart object. Let's look at a few other things that would be better using a smart object. I'll start with the image on the right. I'm just going to change it so we're not working on the background layer. I'll double click and call it anything. Not smart. Okay, and then I'm going to again transform it. This time I'm going to type Command T, and I'm going to make it smaller, and I'll rotate like that. Now, what happens if I decide that the rotation isn't quite what I wanted? I was like, well, the angle should be just a little bit different. Well, if I go back and type Command T once again, it's not going to know it's ever been transformed before, because there's nothing special about that layer. Every time I choose transform, it just glances at what it currently looks like and assumes that's the original. So I type Command T, and look at the transformation handles. They're not rotated anymore. It doesn't remember that I've ever rotated it, so it doesn't know to put them in there. They always start out being square like this. So now I'm going to have to try to figure out what angle to get back to. And I might not be accurate. I might be off a little bit. And so I'll try to get it back. And if I try to scale it back up, it's going to get even softer, because every time you scale up, you get softer if it's not a smart object. Let's go to the smart object. I'll type Command T. I'm going to scale it down, and I'm going to rotate it. And all it's doing when I do that is it's adding to that layer some little accessory information, which is 55% scaling in 30 point whatever rotation. I'm going to press Return or Enter to say I'm done. And now I decide, well, I'd like to use a different rotation. So I type Command T again, and it acts like I never left the transformation. You see how it's still rotated in there? And if I look at the top of my screen, those numbers are there. I can just select this number and type 0 to say take out the rotation. Just like I could take these numbers and say 100, 100, and get it back to its original size. And that's because when you make a change to a smart object, it will limit you in what changes you can make, so that they're only ones that can easily be undone or changed afterwards. Nothing permanent can be done to that smart object. All right? So let's try some other things. I'll take the non-smart one, and just so it doesn't look so bad, I'm going to revert it to get back to what it would usually look like. I'm just going to change the name of the background because there's a lot of limitations on the background layer that I don't want to deal with, so I'll double click on that. And let's apply a filter. Let's say I would like to blur this image with Gaussian blur. So I'll blur it, and I'll bring it up quite a distance. I'll click OK. I'll put it at 180 so I can remember the number. Click OK. And if I save and close the image, we permanently have that. There's no way to get back. And I'd have to find a copy of the original image if I still own one or have one to be able to get it back. If you save and close, then there's no record of what this used to look like. Do the same thing to the image on the left. Go to Gaussian blur. I think I used 180 before. I'll use the same setting. You see the two images look identical, right? But look at how the blurring was applied. If I go to the image on the right, the one that's not a smart object, and I look at my layers panel, there's no clue about what I've done to the image or any kind of options I have down here to deal with. I go to my smart object, though, and look at what we got. That blurring has been applied as what's known as a smart filter. A smart filter is a kind of temporary thing attached to the layer that I could easily throw away to get back to the original image. I can easily change the settings that are being used, all sorts of things that I can do. So let's take a look at what's possible. There's an eyeball icon next to the word Gaussian blur. If I turn it off, you see what the image looks like without the blur. Turn it back on and it reapplies the filter. If I double click on the word Gaussian blur, it brings me right back into Gaussian blur. And if I decided that 180 was too much, I could lower it. It's as if I never left the dialog box in the first place. I never left the filter. I can just at any time change it. If I try to go to the image on the right and change it, I go to Gaussian blur, and I'll say I only wanted a Gaussian blur of 3.6, and it has no idea if this image has been blurred before or not. So all it can do is add more blur. It can't reduce what's already there because it has no record of the first blurring happening. It thinks that is my original picture because there's nothing smart done about it. So it's a little different when we have a smart object because whatever we do to that layer becomes an accessory to the layer that can be thrown away or modified at any time. It's not permanently changing the original that was there. So I can apply more than one filter to this. If I go back to the filter menu, I could apply 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 filters. It doesn't matter. They're all just going to kind of stack up in that list of filters. And I could come in here and say, well, I like my little twirling, but I didn't want the blur on it. So I turn the blur off, and it recalculates the end result. So now we just have twirl without the blur. Or I turn the blur back on, and now we have it. Or I can mask that. If I click on this mask, I could paint with my paintbrush tool, and wherever I paint with black, we're going to remove the filtered effect. I don't know that that'll look great on this image, but it'll bring back the original wherever I paint. So I'll try to get some of the background, maybe one line there, like that. Right? Then at any time, if I decide I don't want one of these, I can turn off its eyeball, or if I want to permanently get rid of part of it, I just drag that component to the trash can. Right? So it can work really nicely. Now, there are some things I cannot do to that layer. In order to preserve the contents of the original that's there and always have it available to calculate, I can't directly affect the contents of this layer through doing things like painting. If I grab the paintbrush tool and I attempt to paint, it says it can't do it. But that's not a problem. All you need to do is create an empty layer on top and put your paint there. That's not a problem. If you want to use a retouching tool, if that retouching tool is set to current layer and you click, it won't let you do it because that would directly affect the contents of that layer. We need to figure out an alternative method for doing it that all we need to do is up here, we changed this when we talked about retouching. We set a setting to current and below, and then you just put a brand new layer on top. And then you can do your retouching. I can do whatever I want. It's just not done directly on that layer because we're trying to protect the contents that's in that smart object. So there's a little bit of a mental shift you have to make because you're so used to just being able to grab that layer and do something to it. You need to put whatever you want to do on a separate layer or limit yourself to features that can be attached to the layer in a special way, like a smart filter. So if I attempt to come up here and adjust that layer, you can in the newest version of Photoshop. If you have an older version of Photoshop, these will all be grayed out. But they decided that they would make these available, but when I apply them, watch what happens. So I made some sort of a change. I click OK, and it shows up along with those filters. All right? It's thought of as being a filter, as if it was found under the filter menu. They needed to just figure out how could we somehow implement this, and they happen to do it in a semi-weird way. That means that now we can apply our adjustments in multiple ways. We have 3 ways to apply an adjustment. A direct adjustment. A direct adjustment is when you're not working with smart objects, like the image on the right. You can usually go to Image, Adjustments, and choose something. In this case, I made it black and white, but it's permanent. Save and close that image, and there's no way to get it back. Go over here to the smart object and do the same thing. Choose black and white. We can make it black and white, but it's not permanent. It's in this list. And this mask will affect it. It'll affect all of those that are there. I can shift click on that, turn it off, but you can see we can get it black and white. Not permanent at all. Because it's in this list, it's just an accessory to the layer. I could turn off the eyeball, we go back to color. I could click on that and drag it to the trash, and it would be not showing up at all. That's if it's a smart object. Okay? Smart objects are special. They protect the original content of that layer. So enough of looking at these 2 images because they're not the most exciting. Let's then look at a special kind of smart object. I hope we'll be able to do this. I had one issue earlier here that we'll see if it'll work. I'm going to open a RAW file. Do you know how when you double click on a RAW file, it sends you into Camera Raw? That's how it works. We talked about it in the 2nd session of this seminar. And in Camera Raw, you have a button in the lower right called Open Image. And if you open that, you're going to open a dumb image. A non-smart object is what you're going to end up with. But if you hold down the Shift key, then watch what happens to that button that usually says Open Image. When I hold Shift, it says Open Object. That means Smart Object. If I click Open Object, now when it comes into Photoshop, it's going to already have that little icon on top of its little thumbnail. See it there? And it's really special setup now. Because if I were to want to make changes to the raw settings that are being applied, all I need to do is go into my Layers panel, and I'm going to double click on the thumbnail image for that layer. And when I do, Camera Raw should pop open. And I could come in here and make further changes to this image. In case it's not colorful enough, let's amp it up. All right, and when I click OK, it'll update this. And that's really cool because I could, you remember that layered image I made of those icebergs that were black and white? Well, if I would have done it this way, where when I imported those images into Photoshop, if I would have gotten them into Smart Objects, then when I was completely done with that promo that I was making during our layers session, I could have double-clicked on the thumbnail for each one and decided, no, I don't want black and white. Because it would open Camera Raw, that's where I ended up turning it to black and white, and I just turn off that feature. And I do it for each one, and suddenly they'd all be back in color. Or if I wanted to do something else, get more shadow detail on them, and do it in Camera Raw. Just double-click on the thumbnail, I'd be right over there, and I could modify it. So that means I could create a layout with the original images that came from my digital camera and not adjust them at all until I'm already done with the layout that I'm doing. I'm doing a promo that's a brochure, and I'm just using the straight images that came straight from the camera, no adjustment whatsoever. I'm putting them in the layout. Maybe I'm putting them in little fancy boxes and everything else within my layout. And only when I'm done and my boss says, yeah, I like the layout, do I go in and optimize each picture then in Camera Raw. I just double click on the thumbnail, Camera Raw pops up, I adjust it as much as I want, click OK, the image updates. Doesn't matter if I scaled down the picture, rotated the picture, or did all sorts of other things like applying filters to it and all that, it is going to update, which is really nice. Take a while to get used to where your brain really connects with how much stuff that lets you do. It means that you can end up doing templates very easily before the images are optimized and very quickly change things later. Now, let's say that in here, I don't know, I needed to have two different versions of this. I want one where I use different settings on the sky than what I use everywhere else. Well, I'm going to duplicate this layer by typing Command-J. We've done that many times before, Control-J on Windows. And then I'm going to double-click on the duplicates thumbnail to go into Camera Raw. And just to show you that I'm making a dramatic change, I'm going to come in and make it black and white. There's a checkbox called Convert to Grayscale, and click OK. Watch what happens in my Layers panel. Do you see how both layers changed? That's because anytime you duplicate a smart object, it's thought of as having more than one instance of the same smart object. Meaning that all those duplicates, regardless of how many you can have hundreds if you want, they all point back to the same original. And so any change you make to the original changes all of them, which can be good or bad. So I'm going to choose Undo. And here's how you can get a smart object, one that is independent of the other. You know, they contain the same content, but they treat them separately. You choose Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via Copy. The key is the word New. Doesn't it say New Smart Object? Not another instance of the same smart object, but a brand new one. So New Smart Object via Copy. I'll choose that, and let's just make sure it's independent of the other. I'll double-click on its thumbnail. I'll try to make it black and white once again, and we'll just confirm that when I do, the top layer is hopefully independent of the one below it. Okay? So in order to make a copy of a smart object and have it so they are considered independent of each other, I need to go to the Layer menu, go to Smart Objects, and choose New Smart Object via Copy. So now I'll actually go in there and possibly find some settings I'd actually want to use, because I don't want a black and white version. Maybe I come in here and I bring the exposure down further. I bring my contrast down a bit. Maybe I push the white balance way over if I can to get a sky that I like a little better. I click OK, and I'm only concerned with the sky. Then I'm going to end up using a layer mask. So maybe I use the quick selection tool to try to select the sky and some of the surrounding areas. If I can stay in my quick selection tool here. For now, I'll say close enough. But I want to only keep the sky, so I'm going to add a layer mask. When you have a selection, it usually assumes you only want to keep the area selected. So I'll click there. And now you can see that this top layer is affecting just the sky. The bottom layer is affecting the rest of the image. Maybe I want to use the colors from the layer that's underneath, but keep the brightness from this layer. Well, you can always use blending modes. We had a session on blending modes, and I can say luminosity. Luminosity means use the brightness of this layer, but use the color that's underneath. There. So there you see how I got the little darker sky in there. So you can have more than one interpretation of a raw file like that, but you need to know that if it is a raw file that's in that smart object, that you need New Smart Object via Copy to make it so one layer is independent of the other. So let me show you how that works when it comes to not a raw file, but just a normal image. What I'm going to do is in Photoshop, I'll create a brand new document. We're going to make a 7 by 5 inch document, click OK. And then I'm going to go put something in here. Now, if I go to Bridge, and instead of just opening a file by double-clicking on it to get it open, instead, I'm going to drag and drop it. Here I have a little logo my wife uses on her business card, and I'm going to take that and drag it over here. When I let go, it automatically puts the little transformation handles on it, just in case I want to resize it, and I'll scale it down and press return. Now, notice that it's a smart object. When you drag and drop from Bridge to Photoshop, it automatically creates a smart object. Whereas if you just double-click to open it, you have a dumb object. You know, it's not an object at all, it's just a picture. So now let's say I took this and I want to make some sort of frame using a bunch of these, just because I can. If I'm in the Move tool in Photoshop, I don't think we've mentioned this much, but you can hold down the Option key, Alt and Windows, and if you drag, you move a copy. Okay? So I'll hold down the Option key again and drag to move a copy. And whenever they're evenly spaced, it'll bring up a little smart guide and kind of snap to it. So it's relatively easy for me to get a bunch of these laid out. Or I could select all those layers now and just move all of them as a copy. Okay, so I'm getting a bunch. Now why don't we select all those layers. Just going to hold Shift to get the bottom layer. And I'm going to drag them down while I hold Option, use a copy. And then I'm going to grab one of these end ones. I don't know if you remember, there was a way when we talked about layers where we can have it automatically select the layer that's right underneath our mouse. You probably haven't gone through the homework yet, though, so you probably don't remember it, guys. But what it is when you're in the Move tool, you can hold down the Command key and click. And if you do, it grabs the topmost layer that has something right there. That's what I just did to get this layer. And I'm going to pull that one down to get a copy. And I'm just going to make like a little border kind of thing going all the way around like this. And then I'm going to select, oops, didn't mean to hold Option there. Then I'm going to select these middle three, and I'm going to hold Option and move them over here. There, we got our little border, right? All sorts of things. Now, if you want to edit the contents that was originally put into that smart object, you can get direct access to it, where you could go in and paint on it, retouch on it, do whatever you want. And the way you do that is you go to any one of the layers that is the smart object, and you double-click on it. When you double-click on the thumbnail, it shows you the original contents. It's like it opened up the Ziploc bag to show me what's inside. But when it does, it shows up as a separate document. And so what I want to do in this document is I'm going to make it so her camera lens is a different color. So I'll just go over here and use something like my Shape tool. And I'm just going to draw a brand new circle there. And I hope it ends up being a color. I don't see it a color right now. There we go. And that's all I wanted, right there. She's got a colored lens. So if you look over here, we have layers. I have 2 layers sitting there. There's her original logo. There's the little thing I just created. And now I'm going to close this. I'll just close the tab. And when I do, it will say, hey, do you want to save that? And I'm going to say, yes, I do want to save it. When I click Save, though, it's not saving it on my hard drive. It's saving it back to where it came from. Well, when did this document appear on my screen? Wasn't it when I double-clicked on the thumbnail for a layer and then pop, this came up? So it's saving it right back into that same layer. Not necessarily on my hard drive, into that layer. So when I click Save, look at what just happened to every single instance of that. Can you see it? Because when you duplicate a smart object by typing Command-J or by holding on Option when you drag with the Move tool, you're simply creating another instance of the same smart object. All of these point back to one original. And if you change that original, it updates all of them. The only way I could get one to be independent, let's say I grab this one right here, and I want it to be independent, is to choose Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via Copy. That means not a duplicate of an existing smart object, but a brand spanking new one. So if I choose New Smart Object via copy, and then I'll move that down, let's try to edit that one. I'll double click on its thumbnail image, and I'll just turn off the little cover on the lens, and I'll close it. It asks me if I want to save it. I say yes. And now you see that just that one changed? That's because it's independent of the others. Now if I duplicate them multiple times, we're going to have more than one instance of that smart object. But you can have ones that are independent that happen to contain the same content, but to do so, you have to choose Layer, Smart Objects, New Smart Object via copy. Okay?
Thumbnail, does the thumbnail indicate that that's a copied smart object?
No, the thumbnail doesn't give you any indication.
You just got to know.
You just got to know. Yep. Just got to know. So then you can simplify things and make things as complicated as you want as well. I'm going to take all of these that I currently have that we've made here, and it's weird, but you can nest one smart object inside of another. I've just selected all those layers. I have everything selected except for that white background, and I'm going to say Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. That's how you create a smart object to begin with if you don't already have one in here. And when I choose that, it's going to take all those layers in my Layers panel, and it's going to make it look as if I merged them together into one. You see that? It looks like it's all merged into one. What I just did is I put it in a bigger Ziploc bag. All those layers, just whoop, put it in another Ziploc. So there's little bitty Ziplocs inside of a big Ziploc, you know? You can do that. As many layers as you want going in there. So now let's say I come in here and I transform this. I choose Edit, Transform. I'll choose something called Distort. When I choose Distort, I can grab each corner separately, move things like this. Why? I don't know, but just to make it look like it's going off into space. That kind of stuff. I can come in here then and grab a filter. Let's say, or not a filter, let's add an effect. Let's add a drop shadow. So can you see the little drop shadow and everything? Now, boy, I really wish I could still change the color of that lens. I can. Here's how. In order to see the original contents of a smart object, you always double-click on the thumbnail within your Layers panel. And anytime you do that, it appears as a separate document. So I'll double-click on this, and if you think about what was selected in my Layers palette at the moment I created that smart object, that's what I'm going to see, which is all those layers that I had selected, right? Each one of those layers happens to be a smart object. So if I double-click on it, we're going to get yet another document appearing, showing us what's in that smart object. And there it is. And I'm going to come in here and see if I can somehow change the color. I'll do an Option Delete. There, change the color. Option Delete means fill with foreground color. And it just happened to fill that in. And then I'll close that. And when I close it, it asks, do you want to save it? Where's it going to save it into? Not on my hard drive. Back to where it came from, which means back into that smart object. Then I see all these. I'm going to close it. And it's going to say, do you want to save that? I say yes. Where's it going to save it? Back to where it came from, into that smart object. And look, we can have that. That fundamentally changes the way Photoshop works. But it takes a while for your brain to wrap around every little corner of what that does for you. And so it will take quite a bit of practicing to do things to truly get a good feeling for smart objects. Now I can save this in Photoshop file format or TIFF. And when I reopen it, it'll be the same way. It'll still be a smart object and all that. And I find it to be a really nice way to work. There are other features related to it. Let's see what other files I have here to play with. Let's see what we can come up with. Here I have a simple shape. In fact, I'm going to hide some of the things in my Layers panel because I don't need those hidden pieces. If you go to the bottom of your Layers panel, there's the letters FX. And that's where we can do things like add a drop shadow, And I'm going to come in here and choose a choice that's called Pattern Overlay. And in one of the sessions we record, we actually make a seamless pattern, or we actually, how would I say it? We take a pattern that's existing and we turn it into a seamless one. I'll use that pattern. And I got to turn on the little eyeball here because it was turned off. But so we have a pattern applied. Then I'm going to take this layer and let's say I want to do something like scale and rotate. Well, if I type Command T, because isn't that how we scale and rotate, and I scale this down, notice that the pattern is not getting smaller. If I scale it up, the pattern is not getting bigger. If I rotate this, I don't know if you can tell or not, but the pattern is staying straight. It's not rotating. And that's because we're simply rotating the contents of a layer, and then afterwards it's thinking about that accessory that's applied to it, which is the pattern. It's because it's an accessory to the layer. It's sitting right here. And so whatever I changed on this, it makes that change, and then it applies this. So let's see. I'll make a duplicate of this. I can just use the Move tool and hold down the Option key to move a copy over there. And let's turn it into a smart object. So Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. Now look at my Layers panel. Those two are different than each other in a fundamental way, and that is this is a layer with an accessory attached. This layer has no accessory attached. The accessory is inside the Ziploc bag. It's inside the Ziploc. We're working on the outside, and it has no idea what's inside that other than what the end result looks like. It just says this is whatever the contents of that smart object is, whether it be 20 layers or one, all I'm seeing is what would it look like if you merged all those layers together into one piece, and that's what it's showing me here. So now when I take that layer on the right and transform it, I can come over here and you notice that the thing's going. If I bring it back up maybe and I rotate, you see the patterns rotating along with it? And that's because the pattern is inside the smart object, and it can't touch what's inside the smart object. It can't touch the original stuff that's in there. It can only add an accessory to it, which is in this case is a scale and a rotate. And so it's thinking a little different. Or another instance of that. Let me undo this a little bit. Let's see, what would it be? What if I wanted to use a layer mask, for instance? If I made a selection, let's say I made a selection that's round on this one, and then I added a layer mask to the image that's on the left. There we go. Then I take the image on the right, I make a selection, and I add a layer mask to it. Well, in this case, both of those, the layer mask is an accessory to that layer. But then I take the top one and I say, let's wrap that into a smart object. Throw it in a Ziploc. Where'd the mask just go? It's inside. It's inside that smart object. It's not an accessory on the outside of the smart object. And that means I can't get to it right now. I can't get to it without double-clicking on the thumbnail for that layer. And if I do that, it's going to show up as a separate document where I could edit that. Because here's how that could matter. Let's say I grab that image that's below and I transform it and I make it tiny. Is that small enough? Okay, can you see how tiny it is? It's that big. Well, how big is its layer mask then? Its layer mask is that big too. So if I scale it back up, what's going to happen to its layer mask? Well, let's find out. Command T. Real nice layer mask, huh? Because when I scaled it, the layer mask got down to almost no information. I scaled it back up, and it got messy. I take the smart object, though. Where's the layer mask? It's inside the smart object. The smart object is being protected by a Ziploc bag. So when I type Command T, and I scale this one down to almost nothing whatsoever, press Return, and then I type Command T again and scale it back up, it's not going to mess with what's inside the smart object. It can't. What's inside the smart object is protected. The only way I can access what's inside is to double click on that layer, and then it appears as a separate document. Then I can mess with my smart object. But so there are some advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt that you can't get to that layer mask without double clicking. So you have to decide, should it be on the outside where it's attached, like right now if I had a layer mask, or should it be within it? And there are ramifications around that. You can also, and I don't have a great example here, but you can also take Adobe Illustrator files. Let's say you have your logo, somebody made it in Illustrator. If you drag it from Bridge into a Photoshop document, remember how it automatically turns it into a smart object? Well, what's contained within it in that case is an Illustrator file. And if you double click on the thumbnail for that layer, it'll launch Illustrator and open the original in Illustrator. So you can make changes there because it's an Illustrator file. It's weird. Well, here's an interesting one. I think I did this with smart objects. Yeah. I think I used this on a previous video where we talked about layer masks, where I got these to interlace one inside the other. Well, I actually used smart objects when I did this. What I did is I created one shape. And this shape has some accessories attached. I'll turn off that. There it is. This was made with the shape tool. You can make a circle and then take away from the circle and then add and all sorts of things to make this. But I made this, turned it into a smart object, and then I duplicated the smart object and I rotated it. Then I duplicated the smart object and I rotated it. Duplicated the smart object and rotated it. The same way that I end up creating a gear when we talk about tools. I was just more careful with the angles that I used to do so. And I got all these stacked. Turn my effects back on. Well, I'm going to double click on this smart object. There it is. And I'm going to modify it. Anything made with the shape tool is really made out of a path. We talk about paths in a bonus video. With a bonus video, I talk about using the pen tool. I'm going to now close this, and it'll ask me, do I want to save it? And I'll say yes. And suddenly, every single one of those changed. If I just choose undo, you can see it kind of looks like they're dancing. Yeah. So when I made this, if I was like, wow, this doesn't quite extend far enough here, that means it probably doesn't extend far enough there or there because they're all the same. I could just change one of them just by double clicking on it to look at the original smart object, pull that the tiniest bit, and every one of these updates. And so that's what made this a little more interesting to me, to be able to get it so this looks like it's close to looping around and that looks like it's close to it. Well, if I wasn't using smart objects and things, this wouldn't have been fun. It wasn't fun to begin with, but it was, it's just kind of an extreme use of smart objects. Then there are a bunch of different things we can do. Do you remember when I talked about scaling and rotating and how it wasn't permanent? How I could go back and scale it and rotate it more, or I can just type zeros in, or 100% in for the width and height in percentages, and it went back to the original size. Well, there's a whole bunch more you can do with that. Here I'm only going to hint at it because we have a separate session that is about bending, liquefying, and warping images. So I'm not going to describe in too much detail how I'm going to bend a picture around that mug, but I want to show you how when I'm done, Smart Objects makes it a lot better. So I'm going to come over here and go to Bridge, and I'm going to find a raw file to use. I'm just going to grab this one. I don't care which one it is. It's just a placeholder. I'll drag any raw file over. I'll click OK. OK, there it is. And I'm going to get this small. So it's about the size of a picture you might print on that mug. Right over there. Then I want to bend it around the mug. And that's the part where I'm not going to give you a lot of detail as to how, because we're going to do that in a separate session. For now, you can just get a hint at it. Right? I'm going to choose Edit, Transform, and that thing we'll learn more about in a different session. And then I'm going to mess with these things to be able to get this to look as if it might bend around this mug. And I'm not going to spend enough time to make it look perfectionate because we'll have that time in that other session. But for now, I'm going to actually say that's good enough. It's nowhere near truly good enough, but in our other session, I'll show you how to get better at it. I'll press Return or Enter. Then I want it to look as if it's printed on the mug. I wonder if there's a feature in my Layers panel that acts like ink, that will print one layer on top of another as if we're using ink. Maybe it's this menu at the top of the Layers panel, and there was a choice in there called Multiply, which acts just like ink. So now it looks as if that's printed on the mug. I might need to brighten the original photo, though, to make it so I like it. But we have that. I've done all this. I've messed with the image. Remember, the contents of the original Smart Object is a raw file. I dragged a raw file over. That means if I double-click on it, it'll bring up Camera Raw. And if I wanted to, I could make the highlights brighter, maybe the whites brighter. Click OK. And it'll update. And it remembers the warping. It remembers that it's in multiply mode and all that. Isn't that cool? But now I forget where the original raw file is. And somebody wants to use that raw file for a project. Well, I could go here and try to undo this stuff by coming in and choosing warp. And I could, here it's set to custom, I could set it to none. That would make it straight. Press return. Then I could go to free transform. And there I would see the percentages. I could type in 100 to get it back to original size. I could try to go through all that kind of stuff, but I don't want to. In fact, let me choose undo to keep it warped. Somehow, I want to get that raw file. Well, check this out. Where is it? Do you see export? There it is. Export contents. Do you know how when you double click on a raw file, it opens as a separate document? What if I were to save that separate document somewhere else, like on my hard drive? In this case, the separate document, when I double click, is an actual raw file. So Camera Raw pops up. It doesn't actually show me the file or anything, but when I choose export contents, if that's a raw file, look what it's going to pop out right now. Canon raw files end with the letter CR2. It's going to make a copy of that raw file and pop it right on my desktop. So that now I could go onto my desktop, and I think I put it on my desktop. No, it doesn't look like I put it there. I must have put it somewhere else. Let me find out. I'm going to make sure that layer's available. I guess I didn't pay enough attention. But export contents, I put it in documents. That's where I was. And I'm going to say desktop, save. And now if I go and inspect my desktop, there's a copy of the raw file sitting right there. So I was able to get it out of there. But that's not enough. I hate that picture. I spent all the time to get it to bend and be in multiply mode and all that stuff. I want a different picture. Well, I go to the layer menu, I choose Smart Objects, and I say, let's not export what's there. Let's replace what's there. And if I can find a picture of the same dimensions, then it should work perfectly. But if I grab a vertical picture, it's going to be weird, the way it translates. So let me see over in Bridge, if that was one original, why don't we grab this one and I'll drag it over here to the, just so you know, you can drag pictures to the open dialog box if you're ever in it, in your operating system, and it navigates you to that folder and highlights the file. That's part of your operating system, at least on a Mac. So I just found that there. I'm going to hit place, and it will just replace, since it's a raw file, Camera Raw comes up. The file wasn't the same size. What happened is I changed cameras from a Canon to a Sony, and my Sony camera is 44 megapixels. My Canon camera was a lot less. And so this is a bigger file, so it got too big. I could scale it down or be careful, but what I think I'll do is simply find another file that's the same size. I'll just find one of the same era as far as the replace contents, go back to bridge. Where's an old file? That's old, but it's horizontal. Well, CR2s, those should all be the same era. And I'll drag that over here. Hopefully it's the right size. Hopefully it's not a really old Canon I was shooting with and that I had a newer Canon that's the wrong size. We'll find out. It's the wrong size again. But all that means is it was a newer camera, so it was a bigger, higher resolution thing. You get the idea. It could work if it was the same size. If it's not the same size, I'd have to make adjustments. But that's really cool because that means I can, I can make templates that use placeholder images. And then only when I'm done with the template, I know I like it, decide what pictures to use. So that's pretty crazy. Okay. Close that. Close that one. Yes?
Of flattening and merging and merge visible no longer applicable when you're working with smart layers?
They do apply, and if you merge a smart object into the layer that's underneath, you will have done what's known as rasterizing its contents, which means you turned it into a normal layer right before that happened, because there's no way for it to kind of do that and maintain it as smart object, because the bottom layer most likely won't be a smart object, and even if they are two smart objects, it doesn't have the sophistication to be able to somehow meld them together and keep them as smart objects. So that is one area where it would be a little different whenever you merge layers. So if you take a smart object layer and a normal empty layer below it and choose merge down, that smart object just became a normal layer. The little icon on its thumbnail will go away. And if you want to do that manually, you can. If you go into Photoshop and you have a smart object, you can choose Layer, Smart Objects, Rasterize. Rasterize means turn into normal layer. And that means if that particular layer had been scaled down and it really contained a lot more information than it was actually showing you because you have a scaled down version, suddenly it permanently scaled it down. So when I choose Rasterize, watch the top layer, look at its thumbnail image. And when I choose Rasterize, you see the icon went away. Now that's a normal layer. It's as if I never used smart objects. There's nothing special about it. So sometimes smart objects get in the way. You're trying to do something and it's complaining, I can't paint on this, I can't do something. And you're like, well, screw it. I don't need the advantage of that smart object anymore. I got it to the size I want, the rotation I want, everything's perfect. I just want to paint on it. So you're like, fine, I'll rasterize it. And now you've done that. So it is a little different with that.
Again, the things that you can't do on it. The one painting was one, and
you can't directly change its contents using painting or retouching tools. And if you apply adjustments, they must either be adjustment layers or they're just going to show up as accessories to that layer, just like filters would. So it will be a little different. But mainly anything that would need access to the actual pixels, and when you do it, it can't show up as one of those things like a smart filter. So you'll experiment, you'll notice a no symbol, the little circle with the line, diagonal line through it, whenever you're using one of those features. And you just have to decide, is there any way I can get the same end result by possibly putting on an empty layer right above it? And then you get the same visual end result and everything, but it's just not directly affecting that layer. Or double click on the smart object, have it open and show you its contents. And when you're in there, you can directly affect what's in there because those are normal layers in there, unless it's a nested smart object where you did one inside of another. So anyway, there's all sorts of things we can do. Now let's try one more thing. And this is also another example when I can't give you the images here because I don't have the rights to give them to you. But I used to write a book called Up to Speed. And what the Up to Speed book did is it would only cover the new features when a new version of Photoshop came out. Therefore, if you already knew Photoshop, you just want the up-to-speed book. It brings you up to speed on the new version. Well, now the problem is they update Photoshop way too often, and so the book would be out of date too quick, and so it just doesn't make sense to write it anymore. But I came up with this logo here for up to speed, and down here would usually be the chapter number and the name of the chapter. And so this is a 2-page spread that might be used within it. And I want to use the same logo that's on the right on all my 2-page spreads so that it's consistent. So I have a smart object here. If I double click on that smart object, here is what it's made out of. If I turn off its layers, you can see there I got a layer. Here I got a little bar. There I got a little blurry text. There I got my logo. Here I got this. This was made ages ago, and it could have been made better in that this should have been a smart object so I could change the blur setting later, but it wasn't. This looks like it's even another smart object. I'll double click on it. Okay, it's making little flames in a bar. Okay. I'll close that. So anyway, this is the piece I want to use in multiple documents. I'll close that. So I'm going to see if I can somehow accomplish that. I'm going to choose Layer, Smart Objects, and see if I can try. Do you see this choice here? Convert to linked. Convert to linked. Before I show you convert to linked, let's just start a normal linked, I guess. No, we can do it this way. Convert to linked. So I'm going to choose convert to linked. It's going to ask me where would you like to save the contents of that smart object on your hard drive. Because what I'm telling it to do is I want a smart object that's linked to a file on my hard drive. That literally that's what it contains, is the file on my hard drive. So I'll save this on my desktop. I'll call it black bar. Choose save. And now instead of having the normal smart object icon, it looks like a chain symbol. And anytime you see the chain symbol, it means it's linked to something else, somewhere else, that's not in this document. So in this case, it's linked to a file that's sitting on my desktop. Okay? Then I'm going to open another image, this one. This is another spread. This was supposed to look like a scrapbook of a primate family, you know? And this person looked a lot like my dad because he had big ears, so we snuck me in there. But you'd only see it if you opened the book far enough that you almost broke the spine. So I was one of the primates. But over here on the right side, we should have that same spread, right? So let's see, if I layer, smart objects, convert to link, embed on link, there's a way to embed linked. And it's something I actually don't do very often, but what I'm going to do is see if it'll work this way. I'm not sure if it will. It's honestly something I almost never do because I don't need to use link smart objects. But anyway, there's a way to make it linked. And if it was linked, when I go and edit that file that's on my desktop, it would update all the files it's used in. That means you can have your logo file sitting there on your desktop, and it's used in 10,000 documents. You go modify the logo. You change your logo color. Then the next time you open any of those documents, they all update. Right? I'm going to call relink to file. Let me see if it lets me act like I'm telling it to point to a new file. And I'm going to do this. This isn't the most efficient way of doing it, but I think I just accomplished what I wanted. Yeah, do you see the link symbol? I told it to relink to a file, as if somehow the link got broken or something, like the file was no longer there. So I'm going to go then to my desktop, and I'm going to open that file called black bar. Now, I could do that by double-clicking on this layer, because that's how you look at the content. So I double-click. There it is. And what am I going to do? I'm going to come in here and turn on that little blur that was there, and maybe I'll take this bar that's here, and I'm going to adjust it with maybe hue and saturation and get the colors to look all weird, because we're creating an anniversary edition, and it's got to look weird. So I'm going to close this now and say save. Now, where is it being saved? To my hard drive, because that's what those things are linked to. They're linked to a file on my drive. I choose save. I close it. This one's up to date. Look at this one is too. Both files are up to date. Two separate documents using the same content. You can only do that with linked smart objects. And I'm sorry, I should know better how to link them because it's just something I don't need to use very often. So I didn't recall So we can have linked smart objects, all sorts of really cool stuff. You can also, I wish I wouldn't have closed that, you can unlink them. So if you decide that you no longer want it to be linked, if you choose layer smart objects, there's a choice to unlink it, meaning make this so it's fully contained within this document. There is a choice there for that. So anytime you're creating something that's repetitive, like this, if you make one of those tabs and you're going to plan on putting the others in, why not turn it into a smart object first? Because if you do, every time you duplicate it, they all point back to the same original, don't they? So if I double click on the thumbnail for the layer, I could change the shape of those tabs and would update them all at once. If you wanted to create those circles, create one circle. Before you duplicate it, turn it into a smart object. So then all of them point back to the same original. And if you do that, then when you double click on it, you're going to see it as a separate document. And you can come in here and do whatever you want to that document. And maybe I want to come in here and see if I'm going to modify its shape to make it look. Oh, I'm trying to modify it in the layers panel. You know why? Because the layer is actually larger than the document itself. If you look over there, it looks bigger. This is a shape. So what I'm going to do is use my shape tool and see if I can zoom up on it and modify it. Okay, does it look like it's extended that way? I only look at it extended this way. And I will close that, say save, and now you see how all of them are. You know, you can change them into stars, you can do whatever you want, but if you planned a little bit ahead of time, then you're going to have much more interesting time. Then let's say these are objects I might want to use a lot. Well, do you remember that thing called a library? And with a library, I could use my move tool and I could drag something into here and it would go in there. Well, when I dragged it back out and used it in a document, it's linked to that. You remember how when I did smart objects, it was linked to that file that's on my desktop? This is similar. It's linked to what's in the library. And if I were to go to what's in the library and double click on it, what's in the library, I'd see the original. And any change I make here would suddenly update all the documents it's used within. So there's all sorts of things you can do with this. But I don't even need to modify that. So smart objects are kind of groundbreaking feature. It will take you a while to get used to it. At the most basic level, before you end up transforming things to make them smaller, if you're not certain you got it the right size when you're done, kind of thing, hope you have a smart object. Because then it doesn't matter that you scaled it down. Later on, if you scale it back up, and later on, if you rotate it and then rotate it back, and just scale all over the place, you can do it 30 times if you want. Every single time you did it, it's calculating it based on the original, because that's what's in the smart object. It doesn't mean that I can somehow magically scale an image and make it huge. It just means that it's always calculated from the original, whatever it looked like the moment you turned it into a smart object. That's the amount of information it's using when it's doing the scaling. So whenever I'm creating brochures and I have a bunch of images in there and I might want to move them around and scale them, they're all smart objects. So that when I scale them, it's all calculated from the original. Whenever I'm using filters, it's great when I'm using filters because then whenever I come in and use a filter, right up here it says convert for smart filters. That does the exact same thing as this command. They just put it under the filter menu to kind of suggest that you use it and to make it so even if you don't know about smart objects, you might still use them. But it does the exact same thing. So convert for smart filters. In fact, most of the time when I want a smart object, I don't go to the layer menu to do it because look at how much time it takes me. Layer, where's smart? Oh, there it is. And then you get to there. Instead, it's much faster to just go right there, isn't it? Does the exact same thing. So then when I apply my filter to an image, it's really cool because it appears as its own little accessory over here. And I can turn it off and on. I can double click right here to go right back into the settings, and I can double click over here, and that will let me choose a blending mode to apply that filter with. And so it's really nice. Smart objects just make life easier most of the time. Know that they do make your file size larger. Because when you have that image that you dragged over from Bridge and it was a raw file, suddenly you have the entire contents of that raw file now within your layered Photoshop file. When you have the large image you convert into a smart object and then you scale it down to 1/8 of its original size, you still have the full size image within that file. It's inside that smart object. So your file sizes will be much larger when you use smart objects than when you don't. But they're much more versatile. Now, be careful when using smart objects. You might not think about all the consequences. What if somebody asks you for a layered file? Well, if those are all raw smart objects that you used within that layered file, they can get to your original raw files. That means the full-size originals. Even if the file I'm giving them is only tiny for the internet, but I'm giving them the original and there's a smart object within it, well, it's the original full-size raw file scaled down to that size, but they can say export contents, and boom, they have that raw file. They can get to your high-res, image. So before I give it to a client, I might click on some of those smart objects, go up to the Layer menu, choose Smart Objects, and choose Rasterize to say turn them into normal layers. I'm not going to give these people my good stuff where they could print it huge. I'm trying to just give them a proof, a little one, So sometimes you do have to be careful with how you think about them. Okay? All right. Smart objects, one of my favorite features in Photoshop. They totally changed the way I think about Photoshop, put it on a whole nother layer, another level for me. So tomorrow we're going to talk about what I call shooting for Photoshop. Shooting for Photoshop is where we think about Photoshop when we're out in the field with our camera taking pictures. And if we think about Photoshop when we're out doing that, there's a lot more we can do. A lot of people only think about Photoshop for post-production, where they don't think about it at all when they're out shooting. And we're going to look at all sorts of things. Part of it will be simple things like stitching panoramas or doing what's called HDR. That's where you change your exposure, take the exact same picture, just brighter and brighter and brighter, and then you can combine multiple exposures together to get a wider brightness range in your picture. But we'll also look at a bunch of other really interesting things you probably haven't thought about. But between now and then, why don't you head over to Facebook? Let me know what you thought of this session. Ask the questions that you have in your head percolating. See how other people have been using the same feature, because they'll probably be talking about it there as well. So there's where you get to the Facebook group. If you're not in it already, you do have to ask to become a member because it's a private group. But there's just, I don't remember what the button says, something like ask to join. And all it means is one of our administrators has to come in and approve you. There's no like test or anything. We just hit the approve button. And the reason we do that is so that the comments that you make within the Facebook group are only seen by other people that are part of that group. People just following you in Facebook in general won't see your posts there. Only the people in the group will. Finally, if you want to find me on social media or on the web in general, here are the different places to go to. And this has been another episode of Photoshop CC, the complete guide. Hope to see you next time.